now we got past the last error, and we now have a new error. And basically this is called persistence exception. If you drop a message and there's no subscribers, we've seen that message many times. And when an orchestration basically sends a message and there's no subscribers, this is the equivalent version of that message, persistence exception. And it says, we scroll on down here, a batch item failed persistence, and it gives you the GUID, and then you see this MAIO, which I don't know what MAIO stands for, MAIO commit batch status. The published message cannot be routed because no subscribers were found. And then you get the persistence item exception, failed to publish a message in the batch. This is usually because there's no one expecting to receive the message. Okay, so in order to figure this out, while I was off the video, I went back to our two orchestrations, and let me show you what traces I added. So in the inventory check routine, I displayed two messages, which is actually 7100 and 7000. And the 7000 says I received a message, and the 7100 says I sent back a message. And I just hard-coded the trace file for these. Well, I made it a variable, but it is more or less embedded in the program. It's not programmable from the outside. And I write these new messages to a file called trace pinventorycheck.txt. And in the big orchestration, I then put a message right after the send and right after the receive of our call to the inventory system. So the XML message I'm sending right now should be calling the routine twice because we have two line items on our PO. And so when I go look at the trace of the inventory here, you see the 7000 occurs twice, 7100 occurs twice, and then I see 7000 again, and then I see 7100 and 7000 again, 7100. So there's way too many messages going on here. So what's happening? I'm going to edit instead of browse of this file. Look at the very first message. It says receive PO inventory request. The part number is blank and the quantity is 0. So what that means is when we sent the dummy message to the flat file to initialize our correlation, that message is somehow getting passed through to our inventory orchestration. And the reason I say somehow, it's the way BizTalk works. So when you send a message to even a flat file, which is what we do right here, it always goes to the message box database. Then in the inventory check routine, since we're doing direct binding means receive any message that fits that format that goes to the message box database. So that message is being delivered here. And so what's happening is in this program we're sending basically 3 messages, and we're only expecting back 2 messages. So the messages have to be balanced as to how many we're sending, how many we're getting back. So this actually leads me to another little thing I can teach you, which was the filtering that we actually talked about before. So right here, when we receive this message, we can put a filter. But first we're going to need a promoted field to filter on. So what we're going to do, again, this is getting less and less real world kind of as I go, but it's teaching you some valuable pointers, hopefully. So we're going to go to the inventory request schema. We're going to add another field in here called, so trying to decide what to call it. Okay, let's call it a Boolean, and let's make it is used for inventory. And I guess the opposite of that would be it's used for correlation. And so we're going to make that a Boolean field. And now we'll have to set it to true or false. And the next thing we'll do is we will promote it. And now it's a promoted field. So let me rebuild that project, and then I'll go back to the orchestration. Okay, so now when we send the dummy correlation right here, we need to initialize that new field. It's going to be a parentheses. And it's going to say used for inventory is going to be false. So when I send the dummy message, we're setting this field to false. Now, if I don't remember to fix something, this would actually bomb at runtime. So if you remember up here, we hard-coded the definition of this message, And now we've added a new field, right? And so if we try to set a correlated field to some value, and that field is not actually in the message, you will get an error. So we're going to add right here the name of that field is used for inventory, and then we'll just set quote quote there. Okay, so now we're going to take the same statement, and then in the loop we do want to use it for inventory. So right here we're going to say used for inventory is true, and then we also need to add again that same little field right here. Okay, so we're adding the new field to the XML build, XML load, so that we can properly set that value. Now in our sub orchestration, or our direct binding orchestration, earlier we talked about having a filter here. So now we're going to use the filter on the receive. Remember, this is activating receive, and go to filter expression, and now we're going to say where is used for inventory is true. And that way the false messages will not come into this orchestration, and therefore it won't send any messages back, and everything should balance this time. So I'm going to pause the video, redeploy. Okay, so everything's been redeployed, orchestration, and the host has been restarted. I drop my file, and I'm look at the trace, and I'm going to look at hat. Okay, so first, before I even look to see if there's any errors, I want to look here. And now you see we have a 7000, a 7100, a 7000, and a 7100. Exactly 2 pairs. So that means we received 2 requests and we sent 2 responses. So now we're going to go look at the event viewer to see if we have any errors, and we do not. So we have finally fixed this problem. So just to let you know, like even this little demo I've done for you, it's taken me roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours. And you know, lots of times I pause the video, and while I'm off the video, I'm either trying to debug or investigate or do other things. And so I'm trying to give you here just the summary and the best of the work. So you can see that when you get into this type of orchestration, you will basically you're going to have more bugs, and you're going to be taking longer to figure things out, just because it is a little more complicated. But hopefully, by having me walk you through this, you'll be aware of these types of issues before you start trying these things. And so just to check then our main orchestration now, we go all the way through and we get to orchestration ended. And the other thing I added while I was off the video was the response. So for instance here, 1720 and 1730 were 2 traces that I added. And so 1720 says I've sent a request to the inventory program, and then the response has been received, and then I added this little message here, in stock equals true. So that in the future we could actually have logic then that says, well, if it's in stock, do this. If it's not in stock, do something else. And so if I find the 1730s, we see in stock and we see in stock. And so if I ran a different type of file through with different quantities, I might get back a response of is in stock, is false. So I know this was a series of about 4 or 5 videos, and just to recap what we did here in very high level summary, we created a new orchestration, and that orchestration is kind of like, it's not a web service, but it's kind of like a web service in that it gets a request and it sends a response. So rather than just calling that orchestration using the call shape that's defined in BizTalk, which let's review, over here we have a call orchestration shape. The problem with that is you have to deploy your orchestrations in a specific order, and that's called tightly coupled. And by using what's called direct binding, we allow our orchestration to be loosely coupled. So to do direct binding, we added a port on the side here, and once a port's there, you can right-click configure, and you can see the current configuration settings, and you can see that we made it direct. Okay, so direct binding means, depending on whether it's a send or receive, if it's a send, it means the message is sent directly to the message box without any other intervening adapters. And then on a receive or publish, Once it's sent to the message box, anybody that wants to can pick up that message. And that illustrated a problem here that we were getting too many messages. So we had to add a filter here. And the filter says, only give me messages where, I really want this message to be sent for purposes of computing inventory, not for purposes of setting correlation. The other thing we basically learned and went through in this video was in the big orchestration, we have a loop here. And in the loop, we learned how to do XPath. Actually, we learned how to do a count, so we can see how many nodes there are. And then based on those number of nodes, we loop X number of times. So we loop until we're done with the number of nodes. Then we learned that here we need to set correlation and follow correlation. But then when we compiled, we learned that you cannot initialize correlation in a loop. It says that you're initializing it more than once. So how do we get around that? We have to initialize the correlation before we start the loop. And one way to do that, maybe not the best way, is to send a dummy message. So we actually created a directory on the disk called map demo out dummy correlation. You can see every time I ran the orchestration, I created a dummy little file here, and it basically was using it to set this correlation token. And so the problem with this is you're going to have, after a few days or weeks, you're going to have hundreds or thousands of files piling up in this directory. And then what you have to do is write a nightly task or something that would purge all the files in this directory. The two alternatives to that are to go to the internet and find the null adapter or the nope adapter, and then you actually, here, instead of using a file adapter, you write it to nowhere, which is called the no adapter or the null adapter. Then we also learned inside the loop how to use XPath here, where we built a fairly complex XPath, and then we actually put the loop counter in the middle of the XPath as a subscript, basically. So in the square brackets between here and the end of the first line, we're selecting the PO item sub 1, sub 2, sub 3, whatever the subscript is, and the subscript is the loop counter. We then use that XPath to pull out our part number, and then we do the same thing again to pull out our quantity, and our quantity was numeric, so we had to convert it to an integer. So I think we learned a lot of concepts in this series, and even though it was a little bit complex at times, there's a lot of things that come out here in the real world that you'll need to use.